participate in this meeting. It is so decided. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, in accordance with Rule 39, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. I invite the following briefers to His Excellency Mr. Dennis Francis, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Dennis Francis, and Ms. Sintebele Mbete, Senior Lecturer, Political Sciences, Faculty of Humanities, University of Pretoria. It is so decided. The 9,702nd meeting of the Security Council. The 9,000 is called to order. 702nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the maintenance of international peace and security, addressing the historical injustice, and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council. In the United Nations Security Council. The agenda is adopted. The agenda is adopted. I would like to warmly welcome the distinguished ministers. I'd like to warmly welcome another high-level representatives in the Security Council chamber. Another high-level Your presence here today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Bahrain, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Finland, India, Italy, Kenya, Kuwait, Luxembourg, Namibia, Pakistan, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Senegal, and Uganda to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. I invite the following briefers to His Excellency Mr. Dennis Francis, President of the General Assembly, Mr. Dennis Francis, and Ms. Sintebele Mbete, Senior Lecturer, Political Sciences, Faculty of Humanities, University of Pretoria. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite Her Excellency Ms. Katharina Clifford, Chargée d'Affaires, the delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2024/574, identical letters dated 30 July 2024 from the Permanent Representative of Sierra Leone to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General and the President of the Security Council. transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I warmly welcome the Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, and give him the floor. You have the floor, please.
Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank Sierra Leone for convening this debate. Since 1945, the United Nations Security Council has been a bedrock of global peace and security. But the cracks in its foundation are becoming too large to ignore. And they are contributing to deadlock, stalemate, and stagnation around today's most pressing crisis. And they are feeding a broader crisis of credibility and legitimacy that is affecting multilateralism itself. The Security Council was designed by the victors of the Second World War and reflects the power structures of that time. And the world has changed since 1945. But the composition of the Council, despite a few changes, has not kept pace. In 1945, most of today's African countries were still under colonial rule and had no voice in international affairs. This created a glaring omission that has remained unresolved until now. There is no permanent member representing Africa in the Security Council, and the number of elected members from the continent is not in proportion to its importance. We cannot accept that the world's preeminent peace and security body lacks a permanent voice for a continent of well over 1 billion people, a young and rapidly growing population, making up 28% of the membership of the United Nations. Nor can we accept that Africa's views are undervalued on questions of peace and security, both on the continent and around the world. Mr. President, Excellencies, Africa is underrepresented in global governance structures, from the Security Council to international financial institutions, but overrepresented in the very challenges these structures are designed to address. Conflicts, emergencies, and geopolitical divisions have an outsized impact on the African continent. And this Council's agenda demonstrates this. Nearly half of all country-specific or regional conflicts on your agenda concern Africa. They are often exacerbated by greed for Africa's resources, which are vital to the global economy, and further spread and aggravated by the interference of external actors. The message is clear: there can be no global security without African security. Meanwhile, African countries are ground down by crushing debt burdens and the lack of financing thanks to the global financial architecture in which they are underrepresented and denied the level of support they require. And they contend with ferocious flooding and droughts caused by a climate crisis they did nothing to create. But through it all, Africa has proven to be a willing and able partner for peace, particularly with the United Nations, both on the continent and beyond. Through the joint United Nations African Union framework for enhanced partnership in peace and security, we are addressing complex challenges on the continent, from the Central African Republic to Somalia, the Sahel, and the crisis in Sudan. We are working with the African Union and regional and sub-regional organizations such as ECOWAS to end the scourge of terrorism, which has killed tens of thousands on the African continent, including 11 of our personnel in the Abuja bombing of 2011. Together, we are helping to ensure security, stability, and respect for human rights and the rule of law, while supporting democratic processes and institutions. And this Council's Resolution 2719 has now established a framework for predictable financing of African Union-led peace support operations, authorised by the Security Council through assessed contributions, an important vote of confidence in African capacities and in our partnership. We are now developing a joint roadmap to carry these forward. Meanwhile, African countries host almost half of all UN peacekeeping operations, while contributing troops of their own to global hotspots over the years, including now in Lebanon. Over 40% of UN peacekeepers are African. And let's not forget the meaningful efforts made by African-led forces to restore peace, from Somalia to Lake Chad, from Mozambique to the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In times of crisis and geopolitical division, African countries are often amongst the first to champion peace, multilateral solutions, and adherence to international law and UN Charter. But African efforts and contributions are not being matched by Africa's representation. Ensuring this Council's full credibility and legitimacy means heeding the long-standing call for the UN General Assembly, from the UN General Assembly, various geographic groups, from the Arab group to the Benelux, Nordic and CARICOM countries, and some permanent members of this Council itself to correct this injustice. Mr. President, Excellencies, for different parts of the world to contribute to its proceedings, reform of this Council's membership must be accompanied by a democratization of its working methods. A new agenda for peace puts forward a number of ideas, from more burden sharing among Council members to more systematic consultations with host states and regional organizations, as well as with countries contributing troops and police. And it also calls for improvements and innovation in other parts of the global architecture whose work has a bearing on peace and security. It recommends that Member States elevate the work of the Peacebuilding Commission to realize the untapped potential and help mobilize support for national and regional prevention strategies. This includes closer ties with the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank and regional development banks to secure sustainable financing for countries as they strengthen peace and security, with important implications for countries on the African continent. The Peacebuilding Fund has been a critical catalyst to mobilize the contribution of international financial institutions. The agenda also calls for a revitalized role of the General Assembly in the area of peace and security. A new agenda for peace has been informing negotiations on the Pact for the Future to be adopted at next month's Summit of the Future. The summit provides a critical opportunity to make progress on these issues and help ensure that all countries can meaningfully participate in global governance structures as equals. I urge all Member States to attend and contribute their views and ideas so that African voices are heard, African initiatives are supported, and African needs are met. Monsieur le Président.
President, Excellencies,
addressing the historic injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the Security Council, and welcome the decision to also bring an esteemed voice of civil society, Mr. Thembile Mbete, into the conversation, so ensuring a more fulsome exploration of the issues. For my part, this is just the kind of inclusion which I have sought to promote in the work program of the General Assembly throughout my presidency, and I encourage further deepened collaboration with relevant stakeholders. Excellencies, indeed, today's topic speaks to the urgent and long overdue need to reform the Security Council, a call that resonates too well with Africa as the region that continues to bear the predominant brunt of conflict, and Sierra Leone itself, which has endured but overcome peace and security challenges of its own. And a call that grows louder by the day as the world grapples with crisis after crisis, with the pressure continuously mounting on the United Nations itself. That unacceptable state of affairs, in turn, calls upon this Council, working in close collaboration with the General Assembly, to do much more to take decisive action in the face of recurring violence and unbearable human suffering. As you know better than most, our world is mired in a myriad of challenges, from conflict and climate change to the advent of new masterful technological innovations that are transforming virtually on a daily basis every facet of human existence. The world today is much different than it was in 1945. It is a world in which now 193 member states make up the United Nations, up considerably from the 50 that gathered at San Francisco to establish the UN in 1947. It is a world demanding that institutions adapt to current realities and at the scale and pace required to create meaningful change in people's lives. Amid these pressures, there are legitimate growing calls for a Security Council that is more representative, more responsive, more democratic, and indeed more transparent. There are as well accompanying calls for a revitalized General Assembly that not only assumes a greater role in peace and security matters, but also holds the Security Council as the primary custodian of international security, more accountable for its actions and indeed inaction. Excellencies, for Africa, peace is the key to unlocking its full and extraordinary potential. During my official visits to the continent, I have seen firsthand the consequences of the absence of peace and the importance of the UN's work on the ground. In South Sudan, in particular, I had the privilege of engaging directly with representatives of internally displaced persons, and also spending time with the entities and blue helmets proudly serving with the United Nations mission in the Republic of South Sudan. Beyond continental shores, I met with political leaders in Haiti about the deployment of a multinational security support mission led by Kenya following the adoption of Council Resolution 2699. A strengthened role for African countries in addressing global security and development challenges is paramount, as the Council's presidential statement, adopted unanimously in May, makes clear. Africa is home to 54 of the 193 members of the United Nations. The continent accounts for 1.3 billion of the world's people, hosts the majority of UN peacekeeping missions, and consistently provides 4 of the top 10 countries contributing their nationals to the ranks of the Blue Helmets. The fact that Africa continues to be manifestly underrepresented on the Security Council is simply wrong, offending as it does both the principles of equity and inclusion. It runs counter to the principle of sovereign equality of states and calls for urgency to reform this institution to reflect the world as it is now rather than what it was nearly 80 years ago. Let me close by informing that, for its part, the General Assembly is actively engaged in this important issue in the context of the intergovernmental negotiations. It is encouraging that member states do not deny this historical injustice and we are seeing that momentum is building for change. During the latest iteration of the IGN process, discussions on the 5 clusters and models supported the strengthening of Africa's representation in the Council. As an important outcome of the IGN process, it is further encouraging that the current draft of the input to the Pact of the Future refers to Africa's historical injustice as a matter of priority and treating Africa as a special case. I am pleased that most member states agree that reform of the Council must answer this call. In the end, I hope this actually means something to finally address this historical injustice and will not stand simply as empty pledges without action. Because the question of Africa's effective representation on the Security Council speaks directly to the credibility of the United Nations itself as an inclusive and a democratic organization. As the global institution at the heart of our multilateral system, fighting to deliver global public goods, including peace and security, we cannot continue to take the relevance of the United Nations for granted. We must earn it daily with the actions we take, including meaningful reform, if we are to move our institution forward and establish its credibility among the publics we serve. I commend Sierra Leone's prioritization of the issue of equitable representation in the Security Council and its emphasis on prevention and proactive action in addressing peace and security challenges. I also take this opportunity to encourage all members to continue to contribute constructively to the IGN process under the auspices of the General Assembly. Our objective is to create solutions along a well-designed process, and most importantly, to win back the trust and the confidence of we, the peoples of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you, His Excellency, Mr. Francis, for that briefing. And I'll give the floor to Ms. Sintebele Bete.
Your Excellencies, I would like to thank the Presidency of Sierra Leone for hosting this debate on the maintenance of international peace and security, addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council. And for giving me this opportunity. The West's industrialization was literally built on the back of African slavery. For Africa, the slave trade brought about devastating and irrevocable consequences in the form of depopulation, increased warfare to enslave more people, mass migration, and ecological damage that exacerbated diseases and food insecurity. This sorry history takes us to Berlin in 1884, where, enriched by the products of African slavery, European leaders gathered to partition and parcel out the continent amongst themselves. Hungry for the prestige and riches to be gained from imperial expansion, European presence in Africa was expanded into the interior of the continent, which was declared res nullius, or no man's land, despite the millions of people living there. Justified as a civilizing mission, this plunder of the continent cemented the destruction of economies, state systems, and cultures that was initiated by slavery 400 years earlier. One of those uncivilized Africans wrote in the Lagos Observer in February 1885 that the world has perhaps never witnessed until now such high-handed robbery on so large a scale. Africa is helpless to prevent it. It is on the cards that this Christian business can only end at no distant date in the annihilation of the natives. A major consequence of the Berlin Conference was the imposition of colonial states with borders drawn with a ruler and pencil that divided communities and operated on a logic of extraction and oppression of their populations. This continues to be felt in the unmanageable governance systems on the continent that are often incompatible with democracy and the rule of law. This has led to intractable violent conflicts. In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, African conflicts have dominated the Council agenda. African subjects took up nearly 50% of the Council's meetings and 70% of its resolutions. As was the case in Berlin over 100 years ago, Africa is major milestones in the UN's practice and jurisprudence evolved through the activism of African states, including the declaration of apartheid as a crime against humanity and the adoption of the International Apartheid Convention. Personally, I, who was 10 years old in 1994 when South Africa democratized, would not be here without the efforts of other African states, including Sierra Leone. Over the past 60 years, Africans contributed personnel to UN peacekeeping missions, took up the cause of Namibia or Southwest Africa in the International Court of Justice, and took leadership in the organization, including 2 secretaries general, several undersecretaries general, as well as heads of various UN organs. Currently, the AU and regional actors oversee 10 peace operations comprising more than 70,000 authorized personnel spread across 17 African countries. African-led peace operations operate with greater flexibility, enable more rapid response to crisis situations, and have proven more cost-effective. African peace missions have upheld important UN norms by challenging unconstitutional changes of government. Within the Council, successive African members have cooperated as the A3 to spearhead informal reforms of Council practice, including sharing the pen on African issues, promoting closer relations between the UN and regional organizations, and using visiting missions to ensure security interventions are responsive to the needs of the people on the ground in conflict situations. The continent is ready and willing to take up greater leadership and to do so efficiently, effectively, professionally, and with integrity. Finally, the reform of the UN is necessary to ensure its legitimacy in an uncertain future of new and evolving security threats, like climate change, novel pandemics, and new technologies like artificial intelligence. Failure of the Security Council to solve major conflicts in the past decade, including Sudan, Libya, the DRC, Syria, Haiti, Myanmar, Ukraine, and Palestine, have dented the credibility of this institution. The UN faces a legitimacy crisis as Generation Z and Alpha are exposed to its impotence in real time on TikTok and other social media platforms. The youth of Africa are the future. 70% of Africans are under the age of 30, and despite living in poverty, they are digitally connected and sharing their direct experience of this institution's failures. Research by Indian scholar Rohan Mukherjee demonstrates that representational legitimacy is a necessary condition for good institutional performance. Because if institutions are perceived to be exclusive and unfair, members gradually reduce their participation and compliance with them. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, I beg your indulgence as we time travel to 2045 to a meeting in this chamber commemorating the 100th anniversary of the UN. At that point, Africa will have 2.3 billion people, making up 25% of the global.
As effective representation in the Council, I thank the UN Secretary General, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, the President of the 78th session of the UN General Assembly, His Excellency Dennis Francis, and Dr. Sintembele Bete for their very insightful and thought-provoking briefings. I wholeheartedly welcome the participation of the African Union Committee of 10 heads of state and government on UN security reform and their representatives in this meeting. I also welcome the participation of representatives of member states and interest groups engaged in the intergovernmental negotiations at the UN General Assembly, including the co-chairs, the permanent representatives of Austria and Kuwait, respectively. I thank them for their important work and the urgency with which they are carrying out their mandate under the leadership of the President of the General Assembly. Today, I speak as a representative of a continent that has long been underrepresented in the decision-making process that shape our world on matters of peace and security. It is now a settled view that the UN Security Council needs reforming. The imperative for this reform is irrefutable. Nearly 80 years after its creation, the Council has been stuck in history. Its imbalanced composition is at odds with current realities and unjust, undermining its legitimacy and effectiveness. Africa remains the unquestionable victim. With the absence of structural change, the Security Council's performance and legitimacy remains questionable. Accordingly, as we reflect on the debate's theme and profound implications, it is essential to recognize how the historical injustice has significantly hindered Africa's ability to contribute effectively to global governance. The legacy of colonialism, economic exploitation, and political marginalization has left deep scars on the continent, affecting its development, stability, and influence in international compelling vision and model for reform, one that ensures equitable representation and meaningful participation of Africa in the Council. Africa demands 2 permanent seats in the UN Security Council and 2 additional non-permanent seats, bringing the total number of non-permanent seats to 5. The African Union will choose the African permanent members. Africa wants the veto abolished. However, if UN member states wish to retain the veto, it must extend it to all new permanent members as a matter of justice. The common African position is premised on the fact that by rectifying historical injustice, the international community will not only promote greater fairness, equity, and equality in global governance, but also act on the imperative to ensure the legitimacy and effectiveness of the Council. It will further unlock Africa's full potential as a dynamic and vibrant continent capable of meaningfully contributing to the advancement of peace, stability, and security worldwide. Africa's experiences and perspectives remain invaluable in shaping comprehensive and effective solutions to global challenges. We therefore welcome the general convergence that has emerged from the IGN as reflected in the co-chair's element paper, that there is a wider recognition and broader support by member states of the legitimate aspirations of the African countries to play their rightful role on the global stage, including through an increased presence in the Security Council as reflected in the Eswatini Consensus and SAT Declaration adopted by the African Union in 2005. Redressing the historical injustice against Africa is viewed as a priority, and several delegations emphasized that Africa should be treated as a special case. Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, to fully understand the need to address the historical injustice being done to Africa let me briefly underscore the compelling historical foundations. From the arbitrary partition of Africa during and after the colonial rule, African nations were excluded from key international decisions that affected their future. The lack of sovereignty and political representation during those periods has had lasting effect on Africa's ability to shape global policies and institutions. This historical injustice stems from colonial legacies and power imbalances that persist to date. The legacy of slavery intersects with other forms of historical injustice, including colonialism, imperialism, and exploitation. Africa has long been marginalized in global decision-making processes, and its voice are often drowned out. This results in a lack of meaningful representation on issues that directly affect the continent, such as conflict prevention, peacekeeping operations, conflict resolution, and sustainable development. This systemic bias perpetrates a cycle of marginalization and reinforces the false notion of Africa as a passive actor in shaping global affairs. Furthermore, the political marginalization experienced during colonial rule has contributed to ongoing struggles for stable governance and political cohesion within the African states, further complicating their ability to engage robustly on the global stage. Therefore, the current architecture of international institutions, including the UN Security Council, as noted, reflects the geopolitical realities of post-World War II era, which largely excluded African voices. This paradigm of non-representation or underrepresentation means that Africa's perspectives and priorities are regrettably overlooked in global decision-making processes. The absence of permanent African representation in the Security Council means that decisions impacting the continent are made without sufficient African input, leading to policies that may not align with the needs and aspirations of African nations. This Council is all too familiar with situations where African mediation and conflict resolution efforts were disregarded for interventions that have had and continue to have disastrous consequences on the continent. In view of the preceding, effective representation of Africa in the Security Council is imperative for several reasons. One, the very legitimacy of the Council. Already the Security Council's imbalanced composition and unjust exclusion of Africa in the permanent category and underrepresentation in the non-permanent category of membership undermines its current legitimacy. The unjust composition also adversely impacts the Council's effectiveness. It has been robustly argued that the performance of institutions like the Security Council declines as its perceived legitimacy diminishes, and that international legitimacy depends on inclusivity and fairness. Therefore, to strengthen the Security Council, the historical injustice against Africa must be rectified as a matter of priority. Second, the importance of upholding equity and justice, particularly for equitable decision-making, cannot be overstated. The historical injustice against Africa contradicts the UN's principle of justice, equity, and democratic representation. As the Council members know too well, these principles directly impact the Council's work. Accordingly, Africa's inclusion in the permanent membership category will ensure that decisions affecting the continent are made with direct and meaningful input from those most impacted. Third, to reflect the present global and geopolitical realities. The geopolitical landscape has significantly evolved since 1945. Africa's growing economic, political, and social influence necessitates its representation in key international forums, including but not limited to the UN Security Council. Given Africa's population, number of member states, political significance, and contributions to international peace and security, the UN's immediate corrective action is crucial. Fourth, the effective maintenance of international peace and security. It is noteworthy that more than 60% of the Council's deliberations, decisions, and peacekeeping missions are concentrated or affect Africa. An enhanced African presence will provide invaluable insights and perspectives that will foster ownership, informed and effective decision-making, and interventions. Africa's demand for reform is rooted in the imperative of addressing the continent's unique challenges and aspirations. African leadership and solutions are crucial for addressing African challenges. From persistent to emerging conflicts, terrorism, famine, and humanitarian crises, Africa faces a myriad of complex issues that necessitate global cooperation and solidarity with African leadership. The question that now comes to mind is how can we address the historical injustice and enhance Africa's representation? I strongly believe that the following steps are necessary and can be even considered imperative. First, the early or urgent reform of the UN Security Council cannot be overemphasized. As the primary body responsible for maintaining international peace and security, the UN must undertake a comprehensive reform of the Security Council to expand its membership and enhance its legitimacy and effectiveness. This must include adding permanent seats for Africa. The issue of the UN Security Council reform has been a long-standing item on the agenda of the UN General Assembly, spanning over 40 years. The work of the open-ended working group started more than 30 years ago, and the current IGN has been ongoing for more than 15 years. Much like the decolonization movement in the 1960s, this reform justice movement for Africa must have an end date. It is absurd for the UN to enter into the 80th decade of existence with this scar of injustice against Africa. Additionally, a natural step to address historical injustice being perpetrated against Africa is to enable the continent's enhanced voice and participation. The UN cannot continue to swim against the tide of justice. The African Union's admission to the G20 remains a welcome development that leads the way. Resolutely, this is where the call for treating Africa as a special case and priority in the UN Security Council reform process is fully strengthened. Reform of the Council and other global governance structures is about equitable representation of Africa. By prioritizing Africa's concern, including enhanced representation within the framework of the UN Security Council reform, the UN can demonstrate its commitment to addressing the root causes of conflict and instability on the continent, thereby advancing the cause of peace and prosperity for all. In addressing the historical injustice done to Africa, and as UN member states, particularly existing permanent members, have supported Africa's call for enhanced representation in the UN Security Council, the next logical step is for this Council and the UN member states to champion the call for Africa to be treated as a special case and priority in the reform process. The fact that this is to be reflected in the Summit of the Futures Pact for the Future is a further welcome development. The swift implementation is the next logical step, as justice delayed is justice denied. The symbolism of today being the International Youth Day reinforces the significance of our endeavor. Excellencies, the time for change is now. The call for enhanced Africa representation in global governance structures, especially the UN Security Council, is not just a demand for justice and equity. It is a call for more inclusive, effective, and legitimate international governance system. Let us work together to redress this historical injustice and recreate a Security Council that truly represents the world in its diversity. The time for half measures and incremental progress is over. Africa must be heard, and its demands for justice and equity must be met. In rectifying the historical injustice that has long plagued the continent, the UN has an opportunity to forge a more just and inclusive world order, one that honors the dignity and aspirations of all nations, regardless of their size and stature. Now is the time for action. Africa cannot wait any longer. Thank you. I now resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to Her Excellency Linda Thomas-Greenfield, Permanent Representative of the United States and member of President Biden's Cabinet.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me start by thanking you for being here with us today and for your leadership in organizing this critical debate, the first ever in the Security Council. I would also like to thank Secretary General Guterres, President Francis, and our civil society briefer, Ms. Mbete, for bringing their invaluable perspectives to the table. Colleagues, it has been nearly 8 decades since the Council first met, and its architects couldn't have imagined then what the world would look like today, as we can imagine what it might look like 70 years from now, how demographics would shift, what global challenges would emerge, which international powers would rise up. The earliest beginnings of this body were just that. They were the beginning. Now it is upon all of us, all members of the United Nations, to chart the future for the next generation, to refine, reform, recalibrate, and as my UK neighbor reminded me last night, to strengthen this body, to ensure the Council is more fit for purpose and reflects the realities of today. And that includes ensuring that people across Africa are effectively represented here in the Security Council in this chamber. Of course, as you've heard, this is long overdue. Already home to over 1.2 billion people, half of whom are under the age of 19, Africa has the fastest growing population of any continent. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African. And here's what we know. African countries have long played and continue to play a critical role in strengthening peace and security in Africa and across the globe. These countries have advanced this work through their leadership on this council, through their outsized contributions to peacekeeping missions, through their leadership on climate, on food security, on gender, on youth, peace and security, and through their efforts to resolve conflicts, including those on the other side of the world. And in that vein, I want to recognize Kenya's contribution to the multilateral security support mission to combat gangs in Haiti, showing that Africa's leadership on this council is not just about Africa, but about the world, and that Africa's problems are not Africa's alone to deal with. And so when we talk about reforming this council, strengthening this council, we do so not just for the good of African nations, but to further international peace and security for us all. Because we all benefit when African leaders are at the table. And so as President Biden announced during the UN General Assembly 2 years ago and reaffirmed last year, the United States supports permanent representation on the Council for countries from Africa as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. Permanent representation. Since that announcement, I have met with leaders from around the world to hear their perspectives on Security Council reform. Our approaches and ideas are often different, but we agree on one thing, and we agree on what the problem is, and we agree on what the goals are. So dialogue is critical. It is the only way to advance an issue that has been stuck for far too long. For our part, the United States is advocating for language in the Pact for the Future that supports increasing both permanent and non-permanent seats on the Security Council. And we will push to ensure that the Summit of the Future is a platform for meaningful progress, one that creates a pathway for urgent action on Security Council reform. At the summit and beyond, we will keep working to achieve Council reform. As we work toward that goal, we must also pursue every other avenue we can to ensure effective UN action to prevent and respond to security threats on the African continent and around the globe. In Sudan and Somalia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Gaza, Ukraine, the list could unfortunately go on and on. Violence continues to uproot lives and destroy livelihoods, to exacerbate food insecurity and re-entrench gender inequality, to repeat dark chapters of history. We need stronger, faster, and more effective action from the Security Council to put an end to this violence. And that is why the United States fully supported the adoption of Resolution 2719, creating a framework for the use of UN-assessed contributions for African Union-led peace support operations. This landmark resolution, adopted under the leadership of the A3, creates opportunities to strengthen UN-AU partnerships and to ensure that the UN is responsive to security needs on the continent. We will continue to work closely with our colleagues here in New York and in Addis to operationalize this new arrangement. But colleagues, we must also fight against any attempt to undermine Council action in support of Africa. Just look at the threats facing various panels of experts. These panels are critical UN tools that provide Security Council members with credible, timely, and detailed information about security threats. And yet, as of late, some on this Council have tried to wind down or obstruct these panels of experts, particularly in Africa. It is imperative that we push back against these efforts to weaken our understanding of security dynamics in Africa and around the world. As many of you know, I spent a good part of my life, my career, living and working on the continent of Africa, engaging with people on the continent, doing my part to further peace and security, support refugees in the countries who host them, human rights and development, and observing up close the ways in which Africa, its people, and countries are stepping up to lead. And as I sit here representing the United States at the United Nations, I carry those life experiences with me, fueling my own commitment to making this Council more representative and more effective. So let's stop admiring the problem here. We need to move to solutions. Today, 15 of us sit around this table, and it is my hope that the number grows to include permanent seats for Africa, Latin America, and others, and that in so doing, we're better equipped to live up to the mandate, our mandate, to prevent the scourge of war and advance peace and security for future generations. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to Sierra Leone for bringing this important subject to this chamber.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that statement. And I'll give the floor to His Excellency Lord Collins Highbury, Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State of the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, President. And can I start by also thanking the Secretary-General Guterres and President Francis and Ms. Mbete for their excellent briefings to start this discussion. And it's a real privilege to join you today as the United Kingdom's new Minister for Africa and the United Nations. I am very grateful to Your Excellency, President Bibo, for putting this vital issue on the agenda. It's important that we have this discussion today. We are running out of time. The challenges we face today do not respect borders, and they are sorely testing the international order the United Nations has championed. The highest number of conflicts since the Second World War, a worsening climate crisis, widespread economic hardship, and desperate humanitarian need. This is all fueling a pervasive sense of insecurity, and we must find truly global solutions to these problems. Let me take this opportunity to underscore the United Kingdom's belief that multilateral institutions remain indispensable here, but they are struggling under the strain of new global challenges. For these institutions to represent the world of today, they must be as effective as they can be. So we will work tirelessly with our allies and partners to strengthen them. For this Council, that means expanding our membership in both categories to include permanent African representation as a matter of urgency. We have seen how much African members bring to this chamber through their experience and expertise, particularly, as we've heard, in terms of responding to conflict and promoting peace and security. And as Ms. Mbeki said, they are vital agents for change and progress, and they must be heard. The UK is proud to be working alongside our African partners on issues that are at the forefront of the Council's agenda. This includes on Sudan, where we seek a political solution to end the devastation man-made crisis which has now resulted in famine in the country. Or Somalia, where the Council is working closely with the African Union and Somali authorities to support security transition and counter al-Shabaab. President, Your Excellency, your own country's experience of transitioning from war to peace in partnership with the United Nations provides us with valuable lessons. Of course, I recognise that the obstacles to reform are significant, but the United Kingdom is determined, absolutely determined, to overcome them. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Lord Collins of Highbury, for that statement. And I'll give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Leon Magraman, Secretary General of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad of Algeria.
In international peace and security, a context that is characterized by renewed politicization and polarization, rather, between major powers, by the erosion of international law, by relapse into a selective approach in determining UN priorities, by the application of double standards, by an increasing choice to use force as a way to settle disputes. We are witnessing a severe crisis in the collective security architecture. The Security Council is almost completely paralyzed. It has repeatedly failed to put an end or even to curb fait accompli policies and unilateral measures. The Security Council has been giving precedence to the interests of the powerful over the interests of the weak. It has been providing protection and political cover to the acts of the shamefully unjust at the expense of the legitimate rights of those who have been wronged. In this crisis, the international community is standing idly by as crisis after crisis unfold and deteriorate in an unprecedented manner. This makes it difficult to deal effectively with these crises and threatens the possibility of reaching solutions that contribute to achieving international peace and security. The African continent has been suffering from this painful reality, especially in the Sahel region. Security, development, and humanitarian challenges have taken worrying dimensions. There are increasing external interventions. There are conflicts of interest. Terrorism has been on the rise. Organized crime has been on the rise. There have been increasing hotspots, and there have been worrying unconstitutional changes in these countries. This is reminiscent of a period of time that we thought has long gone. These developments prompt us all to continue working together to allow African countries that are going through turmoil to go back to the political track and to give precedence to dialogue and consensual solutions that do not exclude anybody to achieve peace and security and stability that these countries aspire to. In the same context, we have to remind you of the continued suffering of the Sahrawi people in Western Sahara, occupied for more than 50 years. These people have been waiting patiently for recognition by the international community of its right, inalienable right to self-determination and ending the exploitation of its natural resources in an illegal way. It has been waiting for stopping the practices of occupation that violate its legitimate rights. This people have been looking for the implementation of Security Council resolutions and taking tangible action to push forward the settlement process as part of decolonization efforts by the UN according to the parameters agreed upon by the Security Council. Of course, we have to recall the suffering of the brotherly Palestinian people that is deteriorating day after day amid the genocidal war launched by the occupation forces on the Palestinian people for more than 10 months as a result of the inability of the Security Council to compel the Israeli occupier to stop its violation and its crimes, its violations of international law. The expansionist Israeli occupation is completely disregarding international law. Mr. President, these developments that present a new reality must be dealt with in a spirit of responsibility, must be dealt with decisively based on the principles and values that we are guided by. All these developments has brought to the fore the issue of Security Council reform. The international community must pay due attention to this issue. We are more and more convinced that the Council today needs an African voice, a voice of reason, a voice on commitment, a voice of responsibility. Against this background, the African position in the negotiations on Security Council reform is based on the principles of the Isilwini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. This is the main and only frame of reference. This frame of reference has been strengthened also by the arguments contained in the outcome communique of the 15th summit of the C10 held in Oyala in Equatorial Guinea in November 2023, in addition to the outcome of the 11th meeting of the C10 foreign ministers hosted by Algeria last June. The arguments can be summarized as follows. We call, first of all, for redressing the historical injustice inflicted on the African continent. It is the only group that is not represented in the permanent membership category and is underrepresented in the non-permanent membership category. This is why Africa calls for its right to be allocated 2 permanent seats and additional 2 non-permanent seats, with all the privileges associated with these seats. Second, we call for the reform process to ensure the effectiveness of the Council and its ability to act in the face of increasing challenges to international peace and security. We need to develop a vision that allows the Security Council to dissociate itself from polarization and to focus more on its role and responsibilities according to the Charter of the UN. Third, we call for a resolution that is not only confined to ensuring more representation for developing countries, especially Africa. The reform must include issues related to the working methods of the Council, the use of the veto right, and the interaction between the Council and other UN entities. Expanding the membership alone does not ensure the necessary effectiveness if the working methods are not improved. Representation without effectiveness is insufficient, and effectiveness without representation does not achieve the required and desired goals. Fourth, permanent members in the Council must demonstrate explicit commitment and support to the reform process by responding to the aspirations of the African continent, the legitimate aspirations. Permanent members must participate in a constructive way in the IGN and work seriously to reach a consensus on Security Council reform. The General Assembly and the IGN must remain the only platform to discuss Security Council reform. Any attempts to change this and allow for parallel plans must be rejected. Mr. President, these are the ideas that I wanted to convey to you on behalf of my country. Algeria is firmly committed to the common African position under the leadership of the C10 coordinator, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, His Excellency Julius Maada Bio. Against this background, as a non-permanent member of the Council, Algeria is going to remain a faithful voice in the service of Africa and its aspirations. We are committed to pushing for redressing the historical injustice inflicted upon Africa when it comes to inequitable regional representation of the Security Council. In the same spirit and with the same commitment, we will do our utmost to maintain the credibility of the Security Council and ensure its ability to respond promptly to increasing challenges to international peace and security. I thank you for your attention, and may the peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Magreman, for that statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Shinsuke Shimizu, Ambassador for Tokyo International Conference on African Development, Ambassador Special Envoy for the Horn of Africa, Ambassador Special Envoy for UN Security Council Reform and UN Security Council Elections Affairs, and Ambassador for International Economic Affairs, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan.
I thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres, President of the General Assembly, Denis Francis, and Mrs. Mbete for their insightful briefings. I begin by commending the outstanding leadership of Your Excellency, President Bio, in holding this timely debate. Japan welcomes Africa's initiative in taking a driver's seat in our shared journey of Security Council reform. As Africa has suffered historical injustice, it carries a powerful voice which reverberates around the globe. Security Council reform is at a critical juncture. Current geopolitical developments have exposed the many challenges surrounding the body. If the Council continues to lack fair representation, its legitimacy, credibility, and effectiveness, and even that of the UN as a whole, will erode. That will serve none of us. As a Council member, Japan has worked together with the A3 to enable the Council to fulfill its expected functions. Japan recognizes Africa's growing contribution to the world peace and security, and welcomes Africa's efforts to shoulder more responsibility in the Chamber. The landmark resolutions 2719 on financing of AU-led peace support operations adopted last year is a case in point. Given Africa's essential role in the Council, redressing the historical injustice against Africa and other unrepresented and underrepresented regions is long overdue. To rectify the existing imbalances and the ineffectiveness, the Council has to be reformed with an expansion in both permanent and non-permanent membership. On reform and other issues alike, Japan is a long-standing partner for Africa. Our guiding principle is to support African ownership and co-create solutions through partnership. Since 1993, Japan and Africa have strode forward together under the TICAD, Tokyo International Conference on African Development Framework, guided by our shared goals. Later this month, ministers from African countries will meet in Tokyo again to discuss how Japan and the international community can contribute to Africa's endeavor to tackle their challenges and lay the groundwork for the upcoming TICAD 9 summit next year. Our approach of respecting the principle of African solutions to African problems is consistent with our wide-ranging cooperating initiatives, such as our contribution to the UN Triangular Partnership Programs, the AU Peace Fund, and the PKO training centers in Africa. For Security Council reform, Japan's approach does not vary. We support Africa's aspirations and work side by side, thereby enabling the Council to better address issues in Africa and beyond. Japan, in our national capacity and also as a G4 member, proudly supports the common African position, including no less than 2 permanent seats for Africa. Mr. President, pivotal opportunities await. The summit of the future will be a vital forum to set out the progress made so far concerning reform discussions and send a forward-looking message for future negotiations. Japan supports paragraph on Africa in the current draft text of the Pact for the Future, which rightly touches on the imperative to redress historical injustice. After the summit comes the next critical round of the intergovernmental negotiations. We very much look forward to Africa's reform model being submitted for discussion, as was announced by Sierra Leone on behalf of African Group in the recent IGN, and to further advancing efforts to develop a consolidated model as a concrete step forward. Mr. President, as you rightly stated during the general debate of the high-level week last year, the historical injustice endured by the African continent remain unsolved in the IGN. We have to remind ourselves that the only way to resolve this imbalance is to expand not only non-permanent seats, but also permanent seats with all existing rights and responsibilities. Throughout the history of IGN, the vast majority of member states and groups, including the African Group, the G4, L69, CARICOM, the Nordic Group, the Benelux Group, and several permanent members have been calling for the expansion of both categories. This should be a guiding formula for our actions going forward. We must not lower our ambitions. Just as with other pressing issues facing the UN, we need to come together at a negotiation table in the quest for reaching tangible deliverables through negotiations on a single text. Let me reaffirm our commitment and readiness to do so. We count on Africa as an indispensable partner along the way. You can count on us as well. Finally, I would like to add Japan aligns itself with the G4 statement to be delivered by India later. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Shimizu, for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Mr. President, I wish to thank you for convening this thematic debate on the major issue that is Africa's representation on the Security Council. I welcome the presence of the UN Secretary General and that of the President of the 78th session of the General Assembly, Mr. Denis Francis. That presence bears witness to the importance that we collectively attach to Security Council reform and to the legitimate aspirations of Africa. I also wish to thank Ms. Mbete for her briefing. Mr. President, this reform is awaited by the vast majority of UN member states. France firmly believes that an expansion of the Security Council across its 2 membership categories is vital to strengthen its legitimacy and its representativeness, whilst at the same time preserving its ability to make decisions. That is the bedrock of our collective architecture. We firmly believe that this reform is possible in accordance with the Charter, even in the absence of absolute consensus. That, indeed, was demonstrated by the previous reform of 1963. Mr. President, France's position is clear, long-held and unwavering. It is utterly illogical that Africa, that accounts for more than a quarter of the UN member states, is not represented among the permanent members of the Security Council. That must and can change now. It is in this vein that that we organised, with the participation of the UN, the African Union, C10 and our partners from G4, a roundtable in Addis Ababa in last April on Security Council reform. A reform is possible and Africa can be the catalyst for it. To usher in that reform, we need to undertake without delay concrete negotiations on the basis of a draft resolution. We tirelessly defend this position within the IGN process. The Summit of the Future on the 22nd and 23rd of September will offer a unique opportunity to reaffirm that goal. France believes, as do the majority of states, that an expansion in the two categories of members and an increased presence of Africa, including among the permanent members, are both necessary to achieve that goal. The text of the Pact for the Future must do its duty and reflect this collective ambition. Mr. President, I wish to conclude my statement addressing the issue of the veto. Since 2015, France, with Mexico, has championed an initiative which is separate from Security Council reform in and of itself. It doesn't require an amendment to be made to the Charter. It aims to limit the use of the veto in cases of mass atrocities. The goal of this initiative is twofold. One, to consolidate the legitimacy of the Security Council, and two, to strengthen its ability to fully shoulder its responsibilities when it comes to the maintenance of international peace and security. The current crises on which the Security Council is gridlocked demonstrate the relevance of that initiative. It's already supported by 106 states throughout all regions of the world. We call upon those that have not yet done it to accede to this initiative to get things moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Representative of France, for that statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Mr. President of the Security Council, Mr. President of the General Assembly, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, distinguished members of the Council, Mozambique wishes to commend the Sierra Leone's presidency for convening this important high-level debate. We thank His Excellency Mr. Secretary General Antonio Guterres for his strong, principled and long-standing advocacy and friendship with Africa in search for a just and fair global peace and security architecture. We are grateful to His Excellency Mr. Denis Francis, President of the General Assembly, for his emphatic support for the strengthening of Africa's role in global affairs. We thank Ms. Chitembile Mbet for her excellent presentation before the Council. Your Excellency, Mr. President of the Security Council and the President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, I have been instructed by your brother, His Excellency Mr. Felipe Jacinto Nyusi, President of the Republic of Mozambique, to convey his warmest greetings and heartfelt congratulations to your Excellency for brilliantly assuming the presidency of the Security Council. We, Mozambique, and the African continent at large, highly value Sierra Leone's strong leadership of the African Union Committee of the 10 heads of state and government on the United Nations Security Council reforms, C10. Since 2005, Sierra Leone has been at the forefront in advocating the reform of the United Nations Security Council and ensure Africa's permanent representation as enshrined in the Isulwin Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. Today's high-level debate is a clear testimony to Sierra Leone's continued commitment to this sacred mandate. Mr. President, The issue before us has been addressed in many different fora, notably in the context of the intergovernmental negotiations on the question of equitable representation on an increase in the membership of the Security Council and the related matters, as per General Assembly Resolution 62557. We note with regret that the Security Council's engagement in that process has been modest, to say the least. The Council's position has not changed much since the 1965 expansion that added 4 elected members to the organ. This historical paralysis has become untenable and problematic in recent years as crises proliferate and the institutional limitations of the Council, particularly the deficit in representation, become more apparent. The Secretary General has eloquently articulated today and during our signature event in May, dedicated to solidifying Africa's role in addressing global Africa's challenges. He said, and I quote, "We need to embed Africa participation and leadership across the global peace and security architecture. Today, African countries continue to be denied a seat at the negotiating table, including in the Security Council." End of quote. Mr. President, despite continued and unequivocal support for the common African position by the overwhelming majority of the United Nations member states, progress towards Africa's quest remains elusive. To the dismay of African states, the global consensus on the justice and legitimacy of Africa's call for a permanent seat in the Security Council has devolved into a prolonged, difficult, and unfinished labor process. Hence, Africa, being the only continent without representation on the Security Council, must drive the call to meaningful actions to rectify the historical injustice it endures. We feel, the world feels, that the time has come to unleash Africa's peace power for Africa to hold a permanent seat at the Security Council host table. Mr. President, Mozambique embraces today's discussion as it echoes the call this Council has made in the presidential statement issued during our presidency in May, which states inter alia, and I quote, "The Security Council expresses support for progress in enhancing the role and representation of African states in global governance and decision-making processes." End of quote. The challenges posed by Africa's limited representation in the Security Council restricts to a large extent the continent's ability to deliver effective and positive conflict resolution experience and mechanisms. This can result in delayed international responses, solutions that do not align with the continent's long-term peace and security goals, and an over-reliance on external forces and non-African actors and challenges in an effective implementation of the principle African solutions to African problems. African member states, whether individually or through regional and sub-regional organizations, like the African Union, have been pivotal in maintaining international peace and security. Africa has made sacrifices and faced challenges on behalf of the global community while lacking appropriate and permanent representation in this important decision-making body. We have adopted in December last year the highly acclaimed Security Council Resolution 2719, which addresses a long-standing demand of the continent to ensure access to adequate, predictable, and sustainable financing for African Union-led peace support operations. But we believe it will remain insufficient without the influence and authority that comes by virtue of an African permanent seat. To those who argue that an expanded council would diminish its efficacy, we assert that legitimacy and effectiveness are not mutually exclusive. One does not advance at the expense of the other. In fact, they can be mutually reinforcing. Despite the daunting task of creating a more inclusive, transparent, efficient and effective, democratic and accountable council, and the slow progress of the intergovernmental negotiations, Africa will steadfastly maintain its common position in demanding permanent seats on the UN Security Council. We remain unified and will speak with one voice through the C10 and the A3+, guided by the Zuluin Consensus and the CIRT Declaration. Let us remind ourselves that the other organ of the United Nations, the General Assembly, was able to correct another historical injustice years ago. In 1960, the General Assembly adopted Resolution 1514 that contains the Declaration on the granting of independence to colonial countries and peoples. The Declaration said, and I quote, "The subjection of peoples to alien subjugation, domination, and exploitation constitutes a denial of fundamental human rights, is contrary to the Charter of the United Nations, and is an impediment to the promotion of world peace and cooperation." End of quote. We should consider this as an important basis to correct the injustice that prevails today in the Security Council structure. Mr. President, as we build momentum toward September Summit of the Future, today's debate will carry the call of Africa for a reformed Security Council, one that is fit for the 21st century and better tailored to the realities, challenges, and strengths of our continent and the world at large. Mozambique considers that at the Summit of the Future, Council members should speak with one voice, individually and collectively, for the steadfast correction of the historical injustice and grant Africa, without delay, a permanent presence on the Security Council, fully in line with the tenets of the United Nations Charter and international law. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, representative of Mozambique. Now I give the floor to the representative of China.
Mr. President, China welcomes President Bill in presiding over today's meeting, and thanks Secretary General Guterres and President Francis and Ms. Mobetti for their briefings. The world today is undergoing major changes unseen in a century, with the rise of the global south and the unstoppable trend of multipolarity. As the youngest continent, Africa has made decades of unremitting efforts to pursue unity and progress, to maintain multilateralism and defend the common interests of developing countries. It has demonstrated an active African image and a strong African power. African countries have become a vibrant force on the global political stage, a rising player in the global economy, a core member of the global south, an important pole in the multipolar world, and a key participant in global governance. At the same time, we regret to see that the African continent is still facing many challenges to peace and development, that African countries have not yet gained the international respect they deserve, that the expectations of the African people have not received sufficient attention, and that Africa's international influence has not been on full display. China hopes that through today's discussion, all parties will gain a more comprehensive insight into the historical injustices against Africa, see the hope for its future, and work together with African countries and their people to promote an equitable and orderly multipolar world and an inclusive economic globalization. I wish to share the following 3 points. First, the historical injustices endured by Africa are a huge moral scar on humanity and a heavy issue that the international community must face today. Historically, Western countries have imposed hundreds of years of brutal colonial rule and blatant racial discrimination on Africa. They carried out the inhumane slave trade and plundered resources, depriving the African people of the natural rights and the dignity they deserve, artificially interrupting the historical process of Africa's development and plunging African countries into a long period of suffering and disaster. This is the root cause of all historical injustices in Africa. Even to this day, some Western countries still cling to the colonialist mindset with a self-righteous attitude on African issues. They interfere in the internal affairs of African countries by using financial, legal, sanction-based, and even military means, and exercise unscrupulous oppression and control over African countries in the areas of currency, energy, minerals, and national defense. To rectify the historical injustices against Africa, we must first and foremost unequivocally oppose the legacy of colonialism and all kinds of hegemonic practices. Western countries should truly shoulder their historical responsibilities, change course, stop such wrong practices as external interference and exerting pressure through sanctions, and return the future of Africa to the hands of the African people. Second, the redress of historical injustices against Africa must be both holistic and focused. It's important to recognize that these injustices are systemic and structural in nature, involving various political, economic, scientific, and technological areas, and manifest themselves in various aspects of rights, opportunities, and rules. This is an undeniable fact and an issue of great urgency. China believes that the primary task is to support African countries on the path of sustainable development as the foundation of lasting peace. When we look at the hotspot issues in Africa on the Council's agenda, poverty and underdevelopment are often common denominators. The international community should promote and implement the UN 2030 Agenda together with AU's Agenda 2063 and support Africa in its industrialization and modernization, and their better participation in the international division of labor so that they can share the dividends of economic globalization and break the vicious cycle of poverty and instability. Third, to rectify the historical injustices against Africa, the fundamental task is to accelerate the overhaul of the multilateral governance architecture and to enhance Africa's representation and voice. Security Council reform is an important part of that overhaul. Based on the common interests of the entire continent, Africa has formed a common position through the Azulvini Consensus, which reflects the justice and legitimacy of Africa's demand for reform and enjoys a unique moral advantage. This is fundamentally different from the practice of a few countries and interest groups who pursue their own selfish and small circle interests when it comes to council reform. African countries' desire to be treated as a special case and a priority deserves the attention and support of the international community. China has taken the lead in its favorable response and explicit support for this request. We are pleased to note that such request has been included in Security Council reform-related text in the Pact for the Future and the IGN co-chairs elements paper, and that Africa's demand is gaining greater understanding, recognition, and support. The reform of the financial architecture is another important area of multilateral governance reform. The current international financial system is unfavorable to developing countries in terms of investment and financing, credit ratings, and economic and technical assistance. It imposes many additional conditions, which severely hampers the development and revitalization of African countries. The irresponsible monetary policies of some major economies have had serious spillover effects, repeatedly reaping the hard-won development gains of developing countries. Such a system is unsustainable and must be reformed and improved as soon as possible. Secretary General Guterres and the Global South have made a strong appeal to the international community to take the Pact for the Future as an opportunity to launch truly ambitious initiatives and push for substantial steps of reform. Mr. President, China and Africa are good friends, good partners, and good brothers who are sincere and friendly, based on mutual assistance and joint development. Since the founding of the new China, China has remained firmly supportive of African countries' just struggle for independence and national liberation, and a development path for Africa in line with its conditions. Since the reform and opening up of China, we have vigorously promoted mutually beneficial cooperation. In recent years, we have upheld President Xi Jinping's philosophy of true and sincere cooperation with Africa, and the principle of pursuing the greater good and shared interests, and have fast-tracked the construction of the China-Africa Community of Shared Future. Under the framework of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, we have carried out all-round, multifaceted cooperation in infrastructure, trade, energy, health, digital economy, people and cultural exchanges, and other areas, benefiting the entire African continent. Early next month, the forum will hold its summit in Beijing. China is ready to work with Africa based on our friendship and cooperation to jointly build a high-level China-Africa community of shared future. China is also willing to work with international partners to sincerely help Africa develop and revitalize itself, support Africa with concrete actions to address historical injustices, promote a more just and rational new international political economic order, and truly enhance Africa's representation, voice, and decision-making in the multilateral governance system. Thank you, President.
Thank you, the representative of China, for that statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I want to welcome you in the chamber, and I want to thank you for your leadership during this month. I wish to begin by thanking President of the General Assembly, Denis Francis, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and Ms. Sittenbilen-Bette for their insights and for the briefings today. Mr. President, the UN and its Security Council were founded in a time of vastly different political and security realities. Since then, decolonization and dissolution of states led to a significant increase in membership. However, the Security Council has not changed in the last 59 years. A changing world demands a council that reflects these changes. It cannot remain frozen in time. Given the multitude of conflicts worldwide and their increasing complexity, the international community needs the Council that responds swiftly, decisively, and effectively with decisions that are complied with. We need fully legitimate, efficient, and relevant Council. Every organization must evolve. It cannot remain static in a dynamic world. It must reflect the present, not the past. The demands for the Security Council reform are long-standing. Leaders of states and governments recognize this urgent need, and this imperative is more pressing than ever. We have a clear mandate for the reform, reinforced by the UN 75 Declaration, calling for a revitalization of the intergovernmental negotiations process. IGN provides the appropriate framework for these discussions. Its establishment was an important step forward, the reform, as it offered a platform for every UN member or group to address all reform-related issues. At this point, we wish to acknowledge the progress made in the last two sessions, for which the co-chairs deserve our commendation. Mr. President, Slovenia agrees that Africa is underrepresented in the Security Council, and we hold a positive view of the Common Africa position. We should work towards a Council where Africa's voice is not only heard, but is integral in shaping policies for tackling challenges to peace and security, both globally and regionally. Securing a stronger and more permanent voice of the region is not only a question of correcting historical injustice, but also a necessity to maintain the legitimacy, credibility, and relevance of the Council itself. We need to move beyond theoretical discussions and deliver tangible progress and concrete results. The interconnectedness of today's security environment calls for a united response, mobilizing diverse perspectives and expertise. Unique insights and experience of African countries are indispensable in this regard. The African Union and other regional-led efforts and initiatives for conflict prevention, management and resolution demonstrate Africa's commitment to regional and global security. To enhance Africa's voice in global peace and security deliberations, we must also continue strengthening cooperation between the Security Council and regional organizations, particularly the African Union. Consensual adoptions of the Resolution 2719 on the financing of the EU-led peace support operations, recent resolution authorizing MONUSCO support for SAMI DRC, and the joint UN-AU efforts to preserve the security gains in Somalia serve as good examples of enhancing African regional leadership. We look forward to the annual joint consultative meeting between the AU-PSC and the members of the Security Council in October. Mr. President, in conclusion, Africa's underrepresentation in the UN Security Council not only denies the continent's pivotal role in shaping global peace and security, but also hinders the UN's ability to address effectively the complex challenges faced by the African countries. Slovenia looks forward to continuing the reform discussions and will remain constructively engaged. Thank you.
Thank you to the representative of Slovenia. And now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, President. We welcome your personal participation in the Council's discussion today on the question of addressing the historical injustice regarding the participation of African states in the work of the UN Security Council. We listened very carefully to the briefings from the Secretary-General and the President of the General Assembly. We're also grateful to Ms. Mabete for her useful analysis of the situation in terms of addressing the historical injustice vis-à-vis Africa. This topic is particularly important to us because the Russian Federation was one of the most consistent allies of Security Council reform in order that its membership reflect the multipolar nature of the contemporary world. Our basic attitude on this important question has not undergone any changes since the beginning of the reform process in 2009. We unequivocally advocate for an expansion of the Council solely to include developing countries from Africa, Asia and Latin America. We see that this is a logical and long overdue step towards addressing the historical injustice, primarily vis-à-vis states from the African continent. The current makeup of the Council in no way corresponds to the overall number of states in Africa, nor the contemporary role of Africa in international affairs. At the same time, I think we all agree that a reformed Security Council must remain effective and authoritative. For this, its membership should not be too broad. It's clear that the Security Council, from 25 to 30 members, will not be able to effectively fulfil its mandate. Moreover, it should retain the effective mechanism that was laid down in the Charter by the UN founders, the veto. It is this instrument that guarantees that the Security Council takes balanced and realistic decisions that determine the prospects for conflict resolution in various regions of the world. It is also utilised inter alia in the interests of Africa. For example, exactly a year ago, when a Russian veto meant that an extension of an irrelevant, counterproductive sanctions against Mali could be avoided. President, unfortunately, in recent years, we've observed from some of our colleagues quite a conjectural approach in terms of including new representatives of Africa in the membership of the Council. If you look closely at their arguments, then it's easy to see that they are more concerned with ensuring that, alongside countries from the Global South, they also include NATO allies in the pool of permanent members. At the same time, it is clear as day that Western countries who are committed to acting as a bloc have already significantly overrepresented at the Security Council. We call on our African colleagues to be alert to this and not make a mistake. And make no mistake, addressing the historic injustice vis-à-vis Africa, while in parallel including new Western members in the Security Council, will not work. For this, the proportion of African and overall developing countries would have to be significantly increased compared with their former colonial capitals and allies, who are trying at any cost and without any justification to preserve their dominant position in international affairs. President, it is our conviction that redressing the historical injustice regarding Africa should not be limited to Security Council reform, because this grim state of affairs is also reflected in other key issues of the multilateral world order, issues that have no less, perhaps more significance for the inherent interests of Africa. We see clearly against the backdrop of their ebbing hegemony, the Western countries, in as much as they can in the spirit of colonial times, are trying to preserve their privileged positions. The consequences of colonialism affect all spheres of life in African society and are a real hindrance to countries of the continent from acquiring a durable role in international affairs. Direct oppression has been replaced by sophisticated forms of neocolonialism, here entrenching the commodity-based nature of economies, harsh IMF programs, and the brain drains. These factors just compound economic underdevelopment, poverty, and political instability in African countries. There is also direct limitations on development and sometimes on the sovereignty of borrowing countries, that is, the growing debt burden. According to UNCTAD data, the overall debt of Africa over 12 years has increased by 183% to $1.8 trillion US, which is 4 times higher than the national GDP growth across the continent. We can't ignore either the critical question for the African continent, that is the problem of mobilizing domestic financing for development. Africa loses up to $150 billion US every year through the siphoning off of assets, the majority of which sit in Western countries or in jurisdictions that they control. There is also a negative impact on development caused by unlawful restrictive measures which currently affect 9 African countries. And this injustice and neo-colonial discrimination is something that the Western countries don't wish to address, and they prefer to hold forth about with their own theories. We strongly believe that economic support for developing countries from Western countries is not a gesture of goodwill. It's a moral debt for the injustice of the exploitative colonial system of the past and the international financial system of today. Since despite their grand statements of Western donors, the amount of development assistance remains meagre, lower than the 0.7% of GNP required in line with international obligations. Around this issue, there is still a lively debate at the negotiations on the draft Pact of the Future. The problem of a lack of representation in the Global South in the managing structures not only of the Bretton Woods structures but also UN development institutions, funds and programmes is loud and clear. It's unacceptable when, for decades, management positions are being held by representatives of one regional group and the secretariats of financial institutions are de facto being privatised by the biggest donors. We trust that with the assistance of the co-facilitators negotiation process, one of which is Namibia, the progress that is so necessary to democratise the global governance system will be achieved. President, against the backdrop of the worsening general humanitarian situation in Africa, the blatant politicisation of the provision of humanitarian assistance from Western donors is surprising. Thus, the UN appeals for many African countries in 2023 were only funded to a level of 20 to 30%, and these same trends are continuing this year. At the same time, for example, in Ukraine, which is an exporter of food, the humanitarian appeal had record levels of funding, 70 or more %. It's also clear that the amount of Western military assistance to Ukraine could easily plug the hole in the majority of UN African humanitarian plans, improving the lives of hundreds of millions of people. However, Western politicians and business people prefer, rather than that, to provide weapons in hotspots and increasing the suffering of people. A similar state of affairs has been observed in international efforts on peace building too. We note that Western donors provide financial support primarily to projects that tie in with their own priorities, when the real needs of African countries regarding infrastructure and technology are often overlooked. Is this actually not just a manifestation of the historical injustice towards Africa? It is high time to put an end to this and move to a just world order, redressing the artificial imbalance from the past, when the majority of Africa was still colonised. Some steps in the right direction have been taken. The recent inclusion of the AU in the G20 and also the expansion of BRICS, largely for African countries. There's no doubt that this will provide opportunities to take the continent's priorities more into account in discussions on key global questions at this platform. Going to the to the topic of our meeting, I'd like to say that there are a lot of practical steps that really would strengthen the voice of African councils in our council today, so they don't have to wait for agreements on the Security Council to be made. Thus, an obvious relic of the old colonial logic at the Council, which is the current distribution of penholderships for country and regional files between former colonial powers. There is a very disappointing situation in place where the majority of peoples in Africa have gained independence, but their former colonizers are still keeping an eye on them from the Council chamber. For years, we have consistently denounced this unfortunate situation, and any efforts to try and address this are being sabotaged by Western countries. President, in conclusion, I would like to underscore that the USSR was always a sincere and true friend of Africa, helping it free itself from the shackles of colonialism and exploitation and stand firmly on its own 2 feet. Today, this friendly and constructive line towards Africa is being continued by Russia. Therefore, our African friends can always count on our support and assistance. And also that we will continue to expose those, as we say, on the back of Africa, try to drag new Western members into the Security Council, and in doing so, try to maintain their influence at the Council and in the world as a whole, so that they can continue to exploit your states and hinder their development. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, representative of the Russian Federation, for that statement. Now give the floor to the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. My delegation warmly welcomes Your Excellency President Julius Maada Bio, and thank you for convening this important meeting. We also appreciate the insights provided by the Secretary General, the President of the General Assembly, and Dr. Mbete. In 1963, there was a Security Council reform. This was led by the Africa-Asian group, including Sierra Leone. This Afro-Asian group then cited that since 1945, 60 new member states had joined the United Nations, a large number of which were from Africa or Asia. They succeeded in adding 4 non-permanent seats to the Council. Since 1963, the UN membership has increased by 80 states. This includes 31 new member states from the Asia-Pacific and 20 from Africa. The Republic of Korea, as a country with vivid memories of colonialism and underdevelopment, and a country that belatedly joined the United Nations, deeply sympathizes with Africa's request for Security Council reform. We wish to once again accomplish the reforms, standing shoulder to shoulder with Africa. Mr. President, given Sierra Leone's activism on Security Council reform as a coordinator of the AU's C10, we view this signature event as an exceptional occasion to deepen mutual understanding on this critical issue. As we outline the following points today, we would like to stress that the sense of marginalization and injustice underpinning today's debate is in fact widely shared by 188 UN member states who have always endured inequality in relation to the P5. First, permanent membership is a unique historical product of 1945, yet it enjoys perpetual privileges, including the veto, which is oftentimes detrimental to the Council's functioning. It is an anachronism in today's eyes. Imagine having a permanent membership more than doubled in this chamber. The vast majority of the UN membership, including the elected members of the Security Council, would inevitably be further marginalized. In addition, increasing permanent members translates into less opportunities for the rest of the UN membership to serve on the Council. This can be considered as creating even greater injustice. The Republic of Korea's consistent and strong reservations about expanding the permanent membership are thus based on the rational and logical conclusion that this antiquity needs to be contained, not proliferated. This principled position is irrelevant to our bilateral relations with any of those countries or regions that aspire to permanent presence on the Council. Second, it is our firm belief that expanding solely the non-permanent membership must be the gist of next reform. Periodic elections are the only means to ensure that the Security Council adapts to the constantly evolving international realities and remain representative. Any fixed composition of new permanent members will serve at best as a still picture or a snapshot of one moment of history. We believe that finding compromise is possible by adjusting specific modalities for elected seats. The Uniting for Consensus group is flexible about this matter, and its proposal of longer-term re-electable seats deserves positive consideration in this vein. Third, equitable geographical distribution as enshrined in the UN Charter will guide us in allocating the expanded non-permanent seats. The rule is simple. Non-permanent seats shall be distributed across 5 regional groups in proportion to the respective group's size. In this connection, my delegation's constant plea at the IGN has been to recognize and be mindful of the fact that the Asia-Pacific is the most underrepresented regional group in the current Security Council, with 53 UN member states rotating on just 2 non-permanent seats. Asia-Pacific can be best characterized by its unique diversity. Our region lacks any regional decision-making mechanism that spans across the entire region, let alone a unified voice on Security Council reform. However, diversity cannot be the reason for less seats in the Security Council, if not more. Fourth, we continue to explore the common African position with great interest. Africa is indeed a special case. Africa's unity and advanced regional coordination mechanism enabled Africa to envisage that 2 permanent seats, rather than permanent members, represent the entire region. This concept of regional permanent seat is inconceivable for other regions such as the Asia-Pacific. It is our understanding that Africa intends to internally nominate candidates for these seats without excluding the possibility of regional rotation. In this regard, I'd like to remind everyone in this chamber that non-permanent seats are in essence permanently allocated to regions for rotation. We look forward to further discussions to find and leverage possible common ground between Africa's idea around the permanent seats and the UFC's proposal for longer-term re-electable seats. Mr. President, supporting African abilities to maintain peace and security goes beyond the composition of the Security Council. With this year marking the 20th anniversary of the AU Peace and Security Council, we commend Africa's tireless efforts to reinforce its peace and security architecture. Africa's growing role in vital areas such as peacekeeping and climate peace and security is a result of Africa's strong ownership in solving African problems and its political will to share responsibility in the global arena. The Security Council should continue to support these endeavors, including by improving coordination with the Peace Building Commission. The Republic of Korea stands ready to actively contribute to sustaining peace and development in Africa. This will build upon mutually beneficial partnership between Korea and Africa, recently reinforced by the first Korea-Africa Summit in June. In conclusion, Mr. President, we should be reminded, in light of the upcoming Summit of the Future, that reform of the Security Council pertains to the effectiveness and the legitimacy of the whole UN system, with a lasting impact on each and every UN member state. In this regard, we look forward to continuing engagement at the IGN. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, the representative of the Republic of Korea. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. And I also thank the Secretary General Guterres and the President of the General Assembly, Francis, and Ms. Mbete for their insights. With a growing young population and heterogeneous cultural and historical context, Africa plays a key role in driving change in the challenging times of today. As echoed in the new Agenda for Peace, Africa's aspirations should be supported and facilitated by the international community, including by the Security Council. These political efforts should also be complemented by the necessary reform of the international financial architecture, as currently being addressed in negotiations of the Pact for the Future. President, this responsibility is necessary to offset the historical underrepresentation of Africa on this Council. As forming part of the Uniting for Consensus Group, Malta fully supports Africa's call for increased representation, and we believe that the UFC model responds to these calls effectively. In the case of an enlargement of the Council up to 27 member states, the UFC model would elevate seats for the African group from the current 3 to 6 elected seats. Some of these seats would also have a longer term, enabling countries with capacity and willingness to further contribute to the Council's work. Malta firmly believes in a Security Council that reflects today's realities, underpinned by a genuine pursuit of equitable representation. This principle should form an integral part of our discussions today. By expanding the elected seat category for Africa, we witness a 100% increase in its representation. Allow me to recall recent achievements led by our elected African partners on this Council, reflecting its effectiveness and democracy. The landmark resolution 2719 on new and assessed contributions for AU-led peace support operations, facilitated by last year's configuration of the A3, Ghana, Gabon and Mozambique, is one such example. By recognizing the complementarity of regional configurations to security in Africa, we are inherently recognizing the significant contributions of African countries to peacekeeping. Through effective co-pen holderships, particularly those related to African files on the Council, Council members have been able to adopt important products. We welcome the recent adoptions of the Presidential Statement on UNOWAS, co-penned by Sierra Leone and Switzerland, and the resolution authorizing MONUSCO's support for SAMI-DRC, co-penned by France and Sierra Leone. Jointly with some of our African partners on the Council, we have also worked to ensure the implementation of the shared commitments on women, peace and security. This includes advancing language on the full, equal, meaningful and safe participation of women in discussions and products, with the WPS informal experts group contributing significantly to this effect. Similar approaches have been invested in addressing the climate-related risks on peace and security, through the joint pledges on climate, peace and security and the CPS informal experts group. President, every time the Council fails to act on the most delicate and urgent matters, often as a result of the pervasive use of the veto, the international community is failing in its responsibility to maintain peace and security. Malta continues to support efforts to curtail the veto's use, especially when faced with the gravest crimes of concern to the international community. Any additional discussions on Security Council reform must continue to take place within the IGN. To conclude, President, let us collectively infuse credibility and prosperity for future generations. Our aspirations are with Africa's. As we share multiple common interests and concerns, so too we share a common approach to finding solutions. I thank you.
Thank you, the representative of Malta. Now I give the floor to Ecuador, the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to thank the briefings for their statements. This timely meeting, as we can see from the way it is unfolding, is but a line in the reams that could be said and a drop in the ocean of what must be done to plug a vacuum that exists on the Security Council and in global governance institutions. This vacuum exists as a result of the insufficient representation of Africa and, of course, other regions of the world in these spaces. For this reason, my delegation thanks Sierra Leone for the opportunity given to debate this issue in this chamber. Due to its demographic, economic, social and cultural growth, the African continent is a key actor in strengthening the United Nations and in multilateralism. It is also the driving force of global development, as emerges clearly in the document entitled Agenda 2063, The Africa We Want. In recent decades, African countries have helped to craft effective responses to the threats to and breaches of international peace and security. Particularly noteworthy are the African continent's work following decisions of the Peace and Security Council of the AU related to the position of the A3 on the UN Security Council. Indeed, this informal caucus, rooted in the institutional framework of the African Union, has made it possible for Africa to increase its influence and impact, and that has resulted in outcomes which go beyond African issues. Examples include Kenya's recent leadership in the multinational security support mission in Haiti, or the traditional and invaluable African contributions to peacekeeping operations at a global level. Ecuador is convinced that Africa has the right to participate on an equal footing in the architecture of global governance. Ensuring they can do that involves reforming not only this Security Council, but also the institutions of the international financial architecture which emerged from Bretton Woods. We must bear in mind that the multilateral system was designed in the 1940s, when the majority of Africa was still under colonial rule. It is crucial to note against this backdrop that only 4 African states participated in the conference which founded the United Nations in San Francisco, and today there are many more African nations. It is clear that the Security Council does not represent today's reality, and in support of that argument, we could provide a series of reasons that we've put forward in other fora. But suffice it to say that the population of the Global South accounts for more than 2/3 of UN membership, while the Security Council represents less than 8%. That undermines its legitimacy. Moreover, the nature of global threats and the definition of international security have both changed since 1945. The Security Council must adapt to these ever-changing and new challenges, such as pandemics, conflicts between non-state actors, international terrorism, and transnational organized crime, among others. These threats can only be resolved through an institution which represents the interests and perspectives of all of humankind, and not solely those of major powers. Mr. President, Excellencies, colleagues, during the 43rd meeting of the first session of the General Assembly held on the 30th of October 1946, the President of the Ecuadorian delegation, Mr. Francisco Illescas Barriero, reiterated the position that had been expressed during the San Francisco conference in the following terms. Here I quote, "The process of honing the United Nations Charter must democratize the organization that is the Security Council in a way that is so logical and legitimate that it quickly leads to the free election of all its members. That will fully restore the sovereign equality of all states and at the same time make it clear that justice reigns, justice exercised and distributed equally throughout the world." End quote. It was also in the San Francisco conference that Ecuador, like many Latin American countries, did not vote in favor of the so-called right to veto in the Charter, given that it was born of the original sin that is secrecy, and that indeed remains a key tenet buttressing my country's foreign policy. I wish to conclude by saying that my delegation will continue to support a concerted and ambitious Security Council reform, particularly within the ideal forum, and that is the working group on the question of equitable representation on an increase in the membership of the Security Council and other related matters. Ecuador believes that a reform of the Security Council is possible with a realistic and flexible approach. It must be tied to an ethical model of democracy based on the principles of alternation and accountability. It must be tailored to the realities and diversities of today's world without new vetoes or endless privileges being granted. The reform must repay our historic debt to Africa and other regions of the world. Many thanks.
Thank you, the representative of Ecuador. Now, for that statement, I call or I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Your Excellency, President Julius Maada Bio, please accept my delegation's appreciation for convening this debate on a subject of long-standing concern to Guyana. I also thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres and President of the General Assembly Dennis Francis and Ms. Setembele Mbete for insightful perspectives. Mr. President, the matter of Africa's underrepresentation on the Security Council and addressing the historical injustice continue to feature prominently in discussions concerning the reform of the organ. Guyana therefore sees this as a historic moment today, and thank you for extending that debate to this table in the Council itself. As members of the Council, we are uniquely positioned to proffer perspectives on this subject, since we are intimately acquainted with the impacts of Africa's underrepresentation on the Council. In this regard, I take this opportunity to reaffirm Guyana's support for the Common African Position, as expressed in the Eswatini Consensus and CERT Declaration. We support expansion of Africa's representation in the non-permanent category of membership and Africa's aspiration to permanent membership as part of a broader reform of the Security Council that also addresses the deficit in permanent membership from other regions, including my own, Latin America, and the Caribbean region. Indeed, Mr. President, the role and power of the Security Council and its current membership is perhaps the greatest of all international paradoxes in a rules-based system. On the one hand, the Council is the only UN organ whose decisions and resolutions are binding on all UN member states. On the other hand, it is the most unrepresentative and undemocratic, unfit for purpose in this century. Against this backdrop, Mr. President, allow me to put forward a few points for reflection. First, Guyana's engagement on the Council over the last several months has reinforced to us the primacy of politics in decision-making, sometimes trumping principle on extremely critical issues. We must consider how this affects the interests of affected countries, particularly those in the throes of conflict and war. Underrepresented regions, such as Africa, from which a comparatively higher number of items feature on the Council's agenda, are therefore at a disadvantage, since this translates to underrepresentation in decision-making on matters that are of direct interest to the region. Even in instances where the strength of Africa's advocacy is enhanced through a coordinated approach in mechanisms such as the A3+, this can easily be countered by the use of the veto in a manner that is contrary to the interests of the country or region concerned. This takes me to my second point, which concerns the use of the veto. In discussions on the reform of the Security Council, some advocate for expanded permanent membership but without the veto privilege. Guyana does not support this proposition, since it advocates the creation of hierarchies of members in the permanent category. Moreover, it will perpetuate the injustice which is the subject of our discussion today by restricting the prerogatives of new permanent members, including from Africa. While we firmly support the abolition of the veto itself, Guyana contends that as long as it continues to exist, all new permanent members should have the prerogative of its use. To do otherwise would also perpetuate the existing imbalance on the Council, the one we are trying to fix. Notwithstanding, the use of the veto has to be curtailed. It should never be used to paralyze the Council in cases of mass atrocities such as genocide, war crime, and crimes against humanity, when the expectation of Council action is great, given its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security. We have extant examples of how effective Council action is stymied when civilians are in extreme circumstances and desperately need Council's intervention to survive. My third point is therefore about the privilege of power inherent in permanent membership. This privilege does not exist in silos, but comes with attendant responsibility. The Charter clearly provides that the Council acts on behalf of all members of the United Nations when carrying out its duties for the maintenance of international peace and security. It is therefore a legitimate expectation, indeed a responsibility of this Council, that the Council would be attendant to the interests of the wider membership on peace and security issues, especially when there is broad consensus for the Council to take decisions of a particular nature on specific issues. I cite, for example, Mr. President, the case of the decades-long Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Council's relevance risks erosion when the privilege of power is weaponized against the very people it is intended to defend and protect. The Council's relevance is also at risk when the privilege of power restricts enforcement of decisions. For this reason, justified accusations of impotence continue to be leveled at this Council. Those countries with this privilege and those that aspire to permanent membership with all its prerogatives must be seized of this perspective and commit to not weaponizing the privilege of power to pursue narrow self-interests, including in situations where the principle of the responsibility to protect must guide Council action. My fourth and final point, Mr. President, concerns accountability. While the Charter is clear that the Council acts on behalf of all Member States, Guyana is of the view that elected members of the Council demonstrate a greater sense of responsibility to their constituents, that is, to the General Assembly that elected them and their home populations that support them. This sense of responsibility is often the driving force behind actions by elected members, including greater involvement by non-Council members in the work of the Council. I am therefore hopeful that the election of new permanent members to the Council would translate to an increased sense of responsibility and accountability and to more actions driven by this. Mr. President, as with most difficult questions on the UN's agenda, the requisite political will can facilitate an early and long overdue reform of the Council, needed to bring it in line with the current composition of the UN membership, making it better fit for purpose. We must muster the political will now, or face the UN's only lawmaking body, losing both its credibility and legitimacy, and risking greater global instability. Addressing the historical injustice against Africa is central in this regard. I thank you.
Thank you, the representative of Guyana. And now I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. Allow me, first of all, to say how honoured we are to be able to speak on behalf of a country that's relatively small, a recent member of the Council, first mandate at the Council that we have, but also a rich history of cooperation with over 4 decades with African countries who's about the history and representative of the Council. Thank you for this humbling opportunity. I would also like to thank our Secretary-General, who not only in his statement today, but in his new agenda for peace, makes a clear plea for reform of this Council, and the President of the General Assembly and Dr. Mabete for their enlightening interventions too. Indeed, when 50 countries met in San Francisco in the spring of 1945 to negotiate our charter, there were only 4 African countries, as we've heard, among them. And yet, Liberia's head of delegation, Clarence Lorenzo Simpson, said something that remains important for countries like mine to this day, and I quote,
"Means to wage war, the dreams and hopes of small nations are only of world peace, the security of their rights and independence."
As for Simpson's third dream and hope, independence, the Charter includes articles on self-determination in chapters 11, 12 and 13, and the United Nations has been able to accompany many African countries on their road towards independence. Today, not only are there 54 African members of the United Nations, but the richness and diversity of their contributions is omnipresent and indispensable to the UN. From contingents of peacekeepers to unique examples of conflict prevention and resolution, often at the local level, to innovative ways of increasing sustainability. Ms. Betty mentioned this herself. 40% of the world's young people will be living in the African continent by 2050. Young Africans will therefore play a key role in shaping the world's future. If the Security Council is to remain credible and relevant, as well as future-looking, it must evolve with this world of tomorrow and offer better representation to the African continent, which has been underrepresented for so long, despite the strong presence of African contexts in the Council's decisions and discussions. Switzerland supports the commitment of African countries to play their rightful role on the world stage. Security Council reform is a necessary and urgent step towards making the Council more representative, more accountable, and more effective. President, with regard to Simpson's second dream and hope, the guarantee of our rights, we have seen, with the adoption of the Charter and a multitude of instruments of international and humanitarian law, great progress within the international community. And yet, today, the peoples of the United Nations are confronted with the greatest number of conflicts, violence, deaths, injuries, displacement. Yes, they are being confronted with a shocking dehumanization. Even the best reforms will not bring greater peace and security to the world if the UN Charter, international law, and international humanitarian law are not respected, or even systematically flouted. All member states have an obligation and responsibility, not only to respect the Charter, but also to implement the resolutions of this Council. The Security Council, for its part, must act in good faith on behalf of UN member states. This requires a relentless pursuit of peace, based on international law and systematic dialogue with the states directly concerned. The Council's working methods are essential to strengthen its accountability, coherence and transparency, and thus the legitimacy and implementation of its decisions. This is why, for Switzerland, improving them remains a priority. And improving methods implies a restrictive use of the veto, as proposed by the ACT Group Code of Conduct, to which 130 countries have pledged not to vote against resolutions in the case of genocide, war crimes or mass atrocities, crimes which have severely affected the African continent throughout its history. President, let us finally come to the first dream and hope of the head of the Liberian delegation in San Francisco, the aspiration for global peace. This is the primary task of this body, the Security Council, and I think we can all agree it is not fulfilling it, certainly not enough and not well enough. Not only is greater representation of African states on the Security Council imperative, it also means it's important to base its work more on regional and local expertise. This Council can learn from the successes of the Peace-Building Commission in certain African contexts, but also from excellent African initiatives such as the panel of the WISE Youth Network, or FemWise. These are instruments of preventive diplomacy that we need to support and make greater use of. Allow me in particular to underscore the important role that African women mediators can play in conflict resolution on the continent and elsewhere in the world. In the same vein, Switzerland encourages intensified exchanges between this Council and the Peace and Security Council of the African Union. The aim is to increase mutual understanding and coherence of our action. Annual exchanges between the two councils enable us to tackle peace and security issues together, based on a regional approach and a global vision. I am therefore delighted to be able to welcome the Peace and Security Council of the African Union in October under the Swiss presidency for in-depth discussions on the issues of such as the role of youth, the implementation of Resolution 2719 on peace operations, or on climate and security. President, in his new agenda for peace, the Secretary-General defines 3 key factors: trust, solidarity and universality. To guarantee these and the strength and the maintenance of international peace and security, African contributions are and will remain essential. The Pact for the Future offers us the opportunity to call in unison for a more representative, effective and accountable Security Council. Allow me to conclude with an African saying that says, "When the music changes, so does the dance. So it's high time that the Council adapts to the music of the 21st century." Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the representative of Switzerland. And now give the floor to His Excellency General Jeje Odongo Abubakar, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Uganda.
Mr. President of the UN Security Council, members of the United Nations Security Council, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates. On behalf of the Government of the Republic of Uganda, I wish to take this opportunity to congratulate Your Excellency Dr. Julius Maada Bio, President of the Republic of Sierra Leone, for assuming the presidency of the United Security Council for the month of August 2024. Let me also take this opportunity to thank you, Your Excellency, for inviting my President, His Excellency President Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, the President of the Republic of Uganda, who due to other state engagements could not be able to participate in this important debate on maintenance of international peace and security, addressing the historical injustice and enhancing Africa's effective representation in the United Nations Security Council. I also thank the entire A3 on the Security Council and the leadership of the government of Sierra Leone for ably steering over the years the African Committee of the 10 heads of state and the strong commitment to advancing the common African position on the UN Security Council reform. Mr. President, history is clear that for centuries, even before the start of the Second World War and before the founding of the UN in 1947, Africa has been relatively a significant actor of international affairs. Africa is known for having been the cradle of civilization and also the cradle of life millions of years ago. During the colonial times, the continent of Africa fed the Industrial Revolution in Europe with resources, raw materials, and human labor, which propelled the development of the North and laid the foundation for the modern world that we see today. Since independence, Africa has continued to provide the world with much-needed resources, including rare minerals, which cannot be found elsewhere on Earth. Africa continues to be the market of the world, with global manufacturers and producers looking at high immense market potential. Today, Africa is a leading contributor to the United Nations peacekeeping operations, thereby playing a very crucial role in the promotion of international peace and security. However, in spite of this, Africa has been unjustly excluded from positions of power and influence in the United Nations Security Council, the main organ responsible for international peace and security. Yet Africa dominates the agenda of the Security Council with an inordinate number of conflicts. To date, Africa has continued to be treated unfairly and unequally in the multilateral space. Africa continues to suffer unfairness in international trade and financial architecture, unfairness in climate change issues, in spite of the fact that it meets the least greenhouse gases, but suffers the greatest consequences. Africa continues to suffer denial of opportunities due to unfair immigration policies and gets less value for our resources due to unfair exploitation by the international capitalists. Amid all these injustices, historic and current, Africa does not have a platform in which her voice can authoritatively be heard and listened to as an equal partner and an important global contributor. A stronger presence at the Security Council would offer Africa that much-needed platform for engagement with the international community as an equal and significant partner. The walls of this hall have heard this call from Africa for a long time. It is high time this call is responded to through the reforms of the Security Council. Therefore, Africa reiterates its call for full reform of the Security Council to address the historical injustice and the urgent imperative to rectify it by making Africa represented in both the permanent and non-permanent categories. Africa is ready to work relentlessly with peace-loving nations to build inclusive, just, democratic, free systems that align with the multipolar world on equal terms. Mr. President, the African Union Committee of 10, under the leadership of Sierra Leone, has been pursuing the mandate to promote, advocate, and canvass for support of the common African position on the reform of the UN Security Council, as stipulated in the Zuluini Consensus and the Sirte Declaration. This position of Africa is that Africa demands for 2 permanent seats and 2 additional non-permanent seats on the Security Council. The Committee of 10 is driven by the hope and conviction of sovereign equality in representation and participation in the intergovernmental negotiations for the reform of the Security Council to achieve a future of shared goals for humanity. The core aspiration of Africa is to get representation in the United Nations Security Council as equal partners and make a contribution to a multilateral system that should become inclusive and work for the interests of all. Mr. President, looking at the current configuration of the Security Council, Africa is very underrepresented. In the permanent members category, Africa has none. Europe has 3. America has 1. Asia has 1. In the non-permanent category, Africa has 3, Europe has 3, America has 2, and Asia has 2. Yet today, Africa boasts of 54 member states, representing 28% of the UN membership. Furthermore, Africa is a continent with immense potential in terms of available arable land, critical minerals to drive the digital revolution, market capabilities, a rapidly growing population, and is poised for economic prowess. Therefore, Africa indeed must be enabled to make its contribution to the world, and therefore should be granted its rightful place in the global institutions, including this Council. Mr. President, the African Group has endeavored to build extensive support within the intergovernmental negotiations process for the enlargement in both the permanent and non-permanent categories and for inclusion of the proposal of those changes in the IGN input in the upcoming summit of the future, a pact for the future. Today, at this high-level debate, we have the opportunity to bring this matter to the Council, fully aware of Africa's growing role in peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and contribution to global security. Africa supports the IGN process for the Security Council reform. We, however, note with concern that the process is not moving forward at a desirable pace. It is taking too long to conclude with the multiplicity of diverse interests. It is in the interest of the international community that the process of Security Council reforms is taken to its full conclusion. Uganda supports the comprehensive reform of the Security Council without any further delay to address this long-standing injustice and imbalance. A just and balanced Security Council will play a very important role in the maintenance of international peace and stability. International peace and security is better served when all stakeholders are able to participate. For this to happen, the current arrangement is insufficient and begs the question of equitable representation and increase in the membership of the Security Council. The reformed Council with equitable representation will enable the Council's legitimacy, effectiveness, and credibility to be improved. I therefore wish to implore the members of the Security Council to take an interest and a closer look at the historical justice that Africa has been subjected to. In the same measure, I urge the Council to recognize the contribution that Africa has made and continues to make towards international peace and security, as well as towards the prosperity of humanity. I invite the members of the Security Council to take this opportunity to act in unison and enable a meaningful reform of the Council, an act that enables the reform that we have been engaged in negotiating for several decades. As I conclude, I would like to reiterate Uganda's support for the common African position and add my country's voice once again to demand for Africa's representation on this Council. I thank you, Your Excellency. I thank you, colleagues, for the attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, General Abubakar, for that statement. And I'll give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Peya Mushelenga, Minister of International Relations and Cooperation of the Republic of Namibia.
Mr. President, in convening today's meeting, Sierra Leone has demonstrated the zeal to remove the thorn that for many decades has inflicted pain in Africa's flesh, a pain underpinned by exclusion, disregard, and marginalization. My delegation commends your wisdom to drive the transformation of global institutions in the right direction. Namibia appreciates the instrumental role played by the government of Sierra Leone and specifically by Your Excellency as a coordinator of the African Union Committee of 10 in bringing this discussion to the Council and reminding the Council of this opportune moment to chart a path that will strengthen its ability for enhanced capacity to effectively deliver on its mandate of maintaining international peace and security. Namibian leaders, including my mentor, the illustrious Theoben Gorerab, who served as the 54th President of the General Assembly, have for long been advocating for the reform of this instrumental organ of the UN to be more representative, inclusive, and reflective of the world itself. It is on their shoulders that I stand today to continue advancing our conviction that the time to adjust the composition of the Council to be fit for present-day realities is long overdue. Namibia has first-hand experience of the inadequacies of this Council when my country had to battle for years for equal and just consideration of our plight against the vagaries of apartheid, colonialism, and injustice. However, in the end, the Council came to recognize and support our struggle for freedom and independence. Thus, we can today hold the strong belief in the invaluable role this Council can and must play in the promotion of international peace and security. Mr. President, this debate takes place at a time when Africa continues to unambiguously assert that it cannot continue to stand as a passive spectator in the global political field. Imagine the whole continent relegated to the periphery of decision-making and emasculated by disproportionate geopolitical power distribution. By maintaining the status quo, democratic global governance remains elusive and contradicts the most fundamental principles upon which the United Nations is founded. This is undesirable and impedes on our efforts to find a solution that garners the widest possible political acceptance by member states, taking into consideration the 5 clusters of reform. Mr. President, Africa appreciates the growing support for the common African position and desires more than an acknowledgement, that her aspirations are legitimate. With a vast segment of the UN Security Council's agenda pertaining to Africa, it is imperative that the issue of Africa not being represented in the permanent category of the Council be urgently addressed. Additionally, Africa's demand for 2 additional non-permanent seats support our quest for equitable representation on the Council and acknowledge the historical injustice to the continent. The demand is best elucidated in the Ezulini Consensus and the CERT Declaration, which jointly comprise the Common Africa Position on Security Council reform. The call for a council that reflects present-day realities is a march for progress in the world and not a request for a favor to the African continent. Oh yes, ours is a voice of reasoning signifying a legitimate plea for justice and advocacy for equality. In our pursuit to advance discussions on the reform of the Council, Namibia aligns with the African position that all prerogatives and privileges of permanent membership must be extended to all new members of the permanent category of the Security Council as a matter of common justice. Africa will continue to advocate for the reform of the United Nations and other international institutions, particularly the Security Council, to correct the historical injustice done to a great continent. We cannot keep postponing the fulfillment of the desires of our people who seek to be seen and heard. Equitable geographic representation is an affirmed long-standing commitment of the United Nations. It is time that the extensive resources that have been invested in UN Security Council reform bear fruit. Tangible steps should be taken to advance the Council's legitimacy, credibility, and effectiveness. Mr. President, it would be remiss of me not to emphasize the patience Africa has exercised thus far. This patience does not mean acquiescence. However, over time, this is bound to diminish. Africa has a growing youth demographic whose degree of patience is minimal, particularly when their dreams of hope are shattered by the expedient total space at which the Security Council reform has been addressed. The cracks in the monolithic that symbolizes democratic governance values are inevitable. Demands are likely to persist for prudent and expeditious actions to ensure equitable representation across governance structures and institutions. Let me conclude, Mr. President, by stating that the reform of the UN Security Council remains a matter of high importance, not only to my delegation or the African people, but to all members of the world community. Let this Council restore trust in its relevance by doing what is just. Let us end the injustice against Africa's exclusion, and let us deliver a Council that truly serves humankind equitably and without discrimination. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Moshelenga, for that statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on my list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 3 p.m. This meeting is suspended.